The sermon this morning comes from the gospel reading which you have just heard. This Sunday, we celebrate the sanctity of life, the sanctity of human life, from the moment of conception all the way to the end of a person's time here on earth, and of course every day in between. In the gospel reading for today, Jesus commands his followers, Christians, to love one another as he has loved us. This command I give to you, he says. Now, God has loved us unconditionally. God has loved us as we were still sinners. God has loved us even though we didn't deserve his love. He loved us anyway. And he's faithfully forgiven us as followers. We were loved when we were young and small and weak and helpless. We were loved as we got older and bigger. And we will continue to be loved as we continue to live this life. Jesus showed his love for you with the ultimate sacrifice for you on the cross. Jesus died in your place. Jesus died for your sin. And there's no greater love than a man would lay down his life for his friends, for that's what you are. He tells us in this reading that in addition to dying for you, not as strangers, but in addition to dying for you, he considers you his friends as well. Now this gives us a picture of God's love, how we can love as God loved us. He cared for you. He cared for your life so much that he would be willing to give himself up, that he would be willing to suffer and die in your place. He gave his life because your life is worth so much to him. Since he has done this, he calls us to then love one another as he has loved. Now, certainly, you don't have to go to the cross and die for the sins of mankind. God already took care of that for you. Jesus has already done that. But the principle of God's love is the same. You can still value the lives of others in different ways. Now again, this is Sanctity of Life. We celebrate the Sanctity of Life this Sunday. I don't know if it's called Sanctity of Life Sunday. But we're celebrating the Sanctity of Life this Sunday, at least in the United States. And in the Western world, we often struggle not just to love one another, but even to figure out how to love one another. It's one thing for God to say, love one another, and then we just kind of figure out what that looks like. But we struggle to know how it is we are supposed to love one another. For some people, they believe that loving others means allowing each person complete and total freedom, libertinism, to do whatever they'd like with their own body, to get out of their business entirely and say, hey, you do you. You just do whatever you want. I'm loving you by letting you do whatever you'd like to. Anyone who has toddlers, try that approach to loving them and see how fast your house catches on fire. Some people believe that to love others is to let them decide everything for themselves and everything for others. Whose lives are worth living and whose lives are to be cut short. But is this the way that God has loved you? Is this the way that Jesus has loved you? Did Jesus die on the cross for the lives of others just so they could be cut short? The truth is that God loved you when he died on the cross, but he also loves you when he tells you how to act. Parents love their children when they tell them, no, please don't light the curtains on fire. How to love one another, how to behave with your own bodies, how to behave with your own possessions, how to behave with other people. God tells us these things. God tells us how to love and how to do these things. In the catechism lesson for this morning, we recited the fifth commandment, thou shalt not murder. To murder someone means to be free to use your body, to do whatever you want with your own body, to behave however you want with your own body, even if that means somebody else suffers. I should be able to do whatever I want with my own body, including stabbing people. This is not what God says when he says to love one another. In God's command to love, God puts limits on behavior. He doesn't give full freedom. To murder is wrong. Even though Jesus died on the cross for murderers, even though Jesus died on the cross for murderers, murder itself is incompatible with love. You cannot love a person and murder them at the same time. You cannot love one another and murder. These are incompatible. They're contrary. With this, a person who murders a young child in the womb in the sin of abortion for the sake of convenience, or because the life of the child will be more difficult, or because the life of the mother will be more difficult, or because the conception of the child was a result of assault, or because a child was unplanned and maybe even unwanted by the mother. For any reason, a person who murders a child in the sin of abortion disobeys God's command to love. These two things are incompatible, abortion and love. Now, in the moment, it may seem like an act of love for the mother to give the mother freedom. The mother may fear that the child is going to grow up with sickness or in poverty, with health risks, or maybe even an unhealthy relationship. So she may try to predict the suffering in the life of the child, and with a desire to love, end up doing something that is very unloving. This is why we rely on God to show us how to love. Because when we try to come up with our own ways, we can often do things very harmful. But here's the thing. Christ saw your life. He knew your entire life before you were even born. He knew every sin you would commit and every bit of suffering you would endure. He didn't have to guess. He didn't have to try to predict. He knew all of these things in advance. Yet in his love for you, he didn't end your life early. He didn't end your life before you were born. But he chose to die in your place. He acted in love when he saw your suffering by dying for you. Now, Christians may be deceived to follow the world's attempt to love. Though the world may legitimately want to love other people, but not know how to. And Christians can fall into this deception. But ultimately, only God can say how to love. Only God can say what is love, to show how to love. And with his death on the cross, he did exactly that. This command I give to you, says Jesus, love one another as Christ has loved you. This is the command. Love one another as he has loved you. Greater love for someone has none than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. Not for someone else, not for someone to lay down the life of his friends, but for someone to lay down the life for his friends. Not for someone to say, well, I'm going to remove you from having to suffer. But for me saying, well, not for me, for Jesus to say, even though you will suffer, I will die for you, so that one day your suffering will end. Now, the world will try to convince Christians that it is empathetic, that it is compassionate, that it is caring to end the misery of a loved one by ending their life. Put them out of their misery. Let them die with dignity. Prevent them from suffering. These are phrases that are used to justify the ending of a life. In the moment, a family member or beloved friend may be suffering from some illness or affliction. Not even an unborn child, but a mother or a father, a grandmother or grandfather. You love them. You want them to be free from suffering. And the world will try to convince you that it is, again, empathetic, compassionate, and caring to end their life to prevent them from suffering further. But again, love one another as Christ has loved you. This is a command. Christ sees the suffering in the life of your mother. Christ knows the suffering in the life of your father, your grandmother, your grandfather, your loved one, your husband, your wife, your child. He sees their suffering and he cares. He loves them perfectly. He loves them better than you love them. And he may heal them in this world, thanks be to God when he does. He may heal them in the next world. We can grieve, but thanks be to God that they are healed there. But he knows what is best and when to take them home. That's not our choice to make. Jesus died on the cross for them, for your suffering family members, suffering for them, instead of ending their life prematurely to prevent their suffering. With his death on the cross and his resurrection from the grave, Christ has made the suffering of every Christian temporary. It will come to an end. This is the promise of the cross. Whatever a person endures, it will come to an end. There's an end to the suffering, a permanent end. Greater love has no one than this, that Christ laid down his life for his friends, to guarantee an end to the suffering. Not for you to try to end their lives, to end their suffering now. Christ has loved you, not just through his actions, but through his commands. He tells you, he shows you how to love, because you may not always know the right way to love. You may not even know the right way to love yourself. The world, again, may lie to Christians to try to convince them that it is better to be dead than to suffer. It is better to be dead than to suffer indignity. It is better to be dead than be helpless and rely on others to take care of you. In Canada and other places in the world, there are some who believe that it is loving to help a person end their life rather than endure suffering. It is better for a child to die than be born alive in a life with suffering. It is better for someone who is elderly to die than to continue to suffer ailments. It is better for someone in the prime of their life to die rather than suffer from depression or cancer or dialysis or anything. They say it is better to die than to suffer. And it is our call to make, not God's. Now, for some, the desire to try to love by offering an alternative to suffering exists. An immediate release from the ailments and responsibilities of this world. But is that how Christ loved? Remember, the command is to love one another as he has loved us. Is that how Christ loved? Is it loving for us to take our own lives, whether by doctor-assisted suicide or by our own hand? To see death as better than life with pain and suffering? To do this, to take one's own life, is not loving. It is not loving in the way that Christ loves. It is to make an idol out of ourselves and our own happiness. To say that our friends and our family who will miss us and our God who loves us, that they matter less than our desire to be free from suffering. I'm tired. I'm suffering. I don't care what happens. I don't care about God. I don't care what he says. I don't care what my family and friends will grieve. I matter most, and what I want matters most. Therefore, I will end it. It is my choice. It is my life. And to die is better than to live and suffer. This is the lie that you are told to believe. Now, for some, suicide is the tragic consequence of mental illness. Martin Luther described the suicide of a Christian believer as one who went out in the woods and was set upon by robbers and murderers. That the devil afflicted them with depression and suicide and ultimately took their life but did not take their soul. For some, suicide is a tragic consequence of illness. But for some, suicide is a service, a medical service offered by those who lie and say death is preferable to discomfort. And still for others, suicide is the ultimate worship of self. That nothing else in this world or out of this world matters as much as what we want and what we want right now. Nothing is wrong. Nothing is worth enduring hardship. That is self-worship. That is idolatry. Not everyone who commits suicide does so out of selfishness. Not everyone who commits suicide does it out of illness. But in either case, it is a tragedy because a precious life has been lost. Today, however, we celebrate the sanctity of life. We grieve alongside those who have lost friends and family, but we also strive to share Christ's love with others. Christ's love with those who have or will consider ending their own life or the life of another. You are called as Christians to love as Christ loved you. That's the command. If God loves you and acts to preserve and value your life, then as a Christian, you are called, you are commanded to love others and to protect their life. As you love, oppose abortion, protect the lives of the unborn. Christ died for the unborn. As you love, oppose euthanasia, protect the lives of the infirm and the elderly. Christ died for them. And as you love, oppose doctor-assisted suicide. And those who wish to tell you that your own life is not worth living, it's a lie. Christ died for you. Jesus says this, "You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit and that your fruit should abide, so that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. These things I command you so that you will love one another." You were chosen by God. You were valued by God. So were the elderly. So were the unborn. Christ chose you all, and he died for you all out of love, out of value for your life, so that you may live now, but also to eternity. Thanks be to God that you have received such a perfect love, not just so that you can have an example to know how to love one another, but because it means that your life has value, that you matter. You are loved. You are precious in the sight of God. You value no matter what. You are loved. So today, as we celebrate the sanctity of life, by doing so, we celebrate the immeasurable love of God for us, for you, and for the entire world. Thanks be to God. Now the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, guard and keep your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.